guys! Today we're going to be talking about the African diaspora in Portugal.
Freedom is
The exact size of the African diaspora in Portugal today is unknown, but the majority are descended from former Portuguese colonial territories in Africa, including Angola, Cape Verde and São Tomé. The regions in Portugal with the highest black population are Lisbon and the Algarve.
For hundreds of years, the Iberian Peninsula, which mostly incorporates modern-day Portugal and Spain, was under North African, Arab, Muslim rule.
From the 8th century onwards, during the Umayyad conquest of Iberia, North Africans known as the Moors defeated the Visigoths and established Islamic control over modern-day Portugal and Spain. At the time, Iberia was referred to as Al-Andalus, and the capital was the city of Córdoba.
During that era, the Iberian Peninsula was a multicultural, multi-ethnic region with a large Afro-descendant population.
This lasted almost 800 years until 1492, when Christian armies began to expand and reclaim Iberia from the Moors in what was known as the Reconquista. The last Muslim stronghold of Granada was reclaimed in 1492. By this time, the Kingdom of Portugal and the Algarve had already emerged.
If you're curious to know more about this period of history, definitely check out my video on the African diaspora in Spain. But for now, back to Portugal. Fast forward to the 1400s and we arrive at the beginning of the Transatlantic slave trade, a period of history which saw millions of enslaved Africans being captured and trafficked across the Americas and Europe. Did you know that this trade movement was actually kick-started by the Portuguese?
It was the Portuguese nobleman Prince Henry the Navigator who sent out the first expeditions to sub-Saharan Africa to explore how far the Moors' kingdom extended and to search for gold supplies. The expeditions returned to Portugal with black African slaves considered compensation for the expense of their voyages.
There are 6 countries in Africa which were former Portuguese territories in which Portuguese is still spoken.
Those are Angola, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, São Tomé and Príncipe, and since 2011, Equatorial Guinea. They are collectively referred to as Lusophone Africa. The Portuguese slave trade can loosely be divided into 4 periods. In the 16th century, the Portuguese mostly traded enslaved Africans from Guinea. In the 17th century, they came from Angola and the Congo. By the 18th century, the Portuguese had expanded into the Gold Coast, or modern-day Ghana and Benin. And in the 19th century, they focused on trading enslaved Africans from Angola and Mozambique. Cape Verde and São Tomé were key distribution centres for Portuguese-owned enslaved Africans.
The majority of enslaved Africans were trafficked to Portuguese colonies overseas, the largest of which was Brazil, or they were sold on to other trading European powers. To find out more about the Portuguese involvement in the slave trade in Brazil, watch my video on Afro-Brazil, which is out now.
Permission for the Portuguese to trade enslaved Africans was granted by Pope Nicholas V, under the condition that they were forcibly converted to Christianity.
Increased demand for slave labour in Portugal meant that the black population increased, particularly in Lisbon and the Algarve, accounting for as much as 10% of the population.
However, there is no way to know how many enslaved Africans were brought to Lisbon, as the records were damaged or destroyed in a colossal earthquake of 1755, which killed tens of thousands of people. The 2 royal institutions responsible for handling Portugal's slave trade were the Casa de Guiné and the Casa dos Escravos. Enslaved Africans in Portugal worked in a number of occupations, including domestic work, mining, metal forging, and on the docks, loading and repairing ships.
There was also a free black population in Portugal of former slaves who had bought their freedom and whose descendants were born free. They usually worked menial jobs such as sailors and street vendors.
A fantastic example of the significant black presence in Portugal can be seen in the 16th century painting Chafariz del Rei by an unknown artist. In it, we see black people in a number of scenarios and professions, including an Afro-Portuguese knight on a horse, widely believed to be João de Sá, nicknamed Panasco.
João went from being the court jester of King John III of Portugal to being made a gentleman courtier of the royal household. He accompanied the king's brother to North Africa to conquer Tunis from the Ottomans, a victory for which he was awarded exceptional honours and was admitted to the prestigious Order of St. James.
In 1761, the Marquis of Pombal passed a decree abolishing all forms of slavery in mainland Portugal, although in practice, enslaved Africans were emancipated in stages over the next 100 years. Slavery continued, however, in Portuguese colonies overseas until 1869, and only ended in the now independent Brazil in 1888.
Following the abolition of slavery in Portugal, many Africans and Afro-Portuguese migrated to other European countries or Portuguese colonies abroad, meaning the black population in Portugal greatly diminished.
In 2017, plans were announced to erect a monument commemorating the victims of Portugal's involvement in the slave trade. It was widely endorsed by the Afro-Portuguese activist group DCQ, the Associação de Afrodescendentes. The project will be called Plantação, Prosperidade e Pesadelo, Plantation, Prosperity and Nightmare, and will be built by the Angolan artist Luanji Quiahenda.
The African diaspora in Portugal grew again, however, in the second half of the 20th century, when the Portuguese colonies in Africa began to gain their independence.
Social and economic inequalities and forced labour under Portuguese colonial rule led to a flourish of liberation movements in the 1950s and 60s across Angola, Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique. These countries, along with São Tomé and Cape Verde, gained their independence in 1975. This prompted a wave of migration of Africans to Portugal to study, find work and establish a life in Europe.
By now, there have been several generations of Afro-Portuguese born on Portuguese soil.
However, racism remains a huge issue in Portugal, and many Afro-Portuguese are still regarded as being African rather than Portuguese, despite having lived in the country for generations and being culturally assimilated.
Afro-Portuguese youths between the ages of 18 and 25 are only half as likely to go to university as white Portuguese, and the incarceration rate in Portugal is reportedly 15 times higher for people of African origin.
There has been much international news coverage of the poor living conditions in predominantly Afro-Portuguese slums, particularly in and around the capital of Lisbon.
Racial profiling and police brutality are a serious issue for Afro-Portuguese communities.
In 2015, 6 black youths were detained and beaten by a group of policemen in an allegedly racially motivated attack. 4 years later, 8 officers were found guilty and mostly handed suspended sentences. 9 further officers were acquitted. In early 2020, the Mali-born Portuguese footballer Moussa Marega walked off the pitch mid-match after receiving racist abuse from the crowd and having seats hurled at him from the stadium.
The referee had the audacity to give him a yellow card for walking off. In spite of the obstacles, Afro-Portuguese activists and academics continue to address systemic racism in Portugal and to expose a whitewashing of Portuguese colonial history.
Famous Afro-Portuguese people include the footballers Nani and Eusebio, singers Sara Tavares and Maria João, and politician Francisca Van Dunem, who was Portugal's first black government minister in history.
That brings us to the end of our video on the African diaspora in Portugal. Don't forget to subscribe for weekly content on the African diaspora worldwide, and find me on Instagram at FreedomIsMineOfficial. I'll see you in the next video.
Freedom